The scent of time was the only perfume Elara Vance knew. It clung to her skin and lived in her hair. A delicate, dry fragrance of decaying paper, brittle leather, and the faint, sweet aroma of archival glue. At 24, her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this library, a cavernous room where sunlight struggled through grimy, leaded glass to illuminate dancing dust motes. Her fingers, impossibly gentle, traced the faded gold leaf on the spine of a 17th-century folio. She wasn't just restoring a book. She was mending a broken timeline, preserving a story most had forgotten. But as she worked, a familiar ache settled deep in her chest. It was the quiet, persistent grief for her own story, its pages still blank, its binding yet to be created, trapped within the crumbling walls of her ancestral home. If you want to discover what happens when this forgotten story is finally forced open, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Her name was Elara Vance, and she was a ghost in her own life. Her movements were slow and deliberate, a habit learned from handling fragile artifacts, but it had seeped into her very being, making her seem like a figure from a sepia-toned photograph. Her beauty was of a quiet, unassuming kind, large, pensive gray eyes that held the melancholy of a long, overcast afternoon and a stillness that spoke not of peace, but of resignation. Her profession as a rare book restorer was less a choice and more an inheritance of duty, a role she had assumed to preserve the last vestiges of the Vance family's faded glory. Every delicate repair, every careful stitch, was an act of defiance against the decay that was consuming not just the books, but her entire world and the future she never had the chance to imagine. Her virginity was not a statement of faith or a shield born of trauma, but rather a quiet, unacknowledged sacrifice. It was the sum of 1,000 postponed moments, a youth deferred in the service of another's decline. For years her life had revolved around the dimming light of her ailing father, the last patriarch of a lineage that had bled its fortune into the very land on which their decaying manor stood. His needs became her own, his comfort, her sole ambition. The idea of romance, of a touch meant only for her, felt like a language she had never learned. It belonged to the heroines in her books, women who lived lives of vibrant, reckless passion. Her own innocence was simply a consequence of her cage, a symbol of a life held in stasis, unwritten and unlived. The Vance Manor itself was a tomb of forgotten grandeur. It was a place of magnificent bones, groaning under the weight of time and crippling debt. A persistent chill snaked through its long, shadowed hallways, a cold that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with loss. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, lemon polish, and the faint, ghostly perfume of withered roses. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow Elara's every move, a silent jury passing judgment on the family's slow, inexorable fall from grace. This house was not a home, it was a mausoleum of honor, and she was its reluctant, solitary curator, tasked with polishing the relics of a life that no longer existed while her own slipped away unnoticed. Beneath her placid surface, a profound void had taken root. It was a hollow space she felt most acutely in the dead of night, when the old house settled into its chorus of creaks and groans. She would lie in her canopy bed, the same one she had slept in since childhood, and feel the suffocating weight of the silence. The books she so lovingly restored were her only escape, offering her glimpses into worlds of daring adventure, sweeping romance, and heartbreaking choices. Yet they were a cruel comfort, highlighting the stark contrast with her own static existence. A deep, dormant yearning for something more, a touch, a risk, a single moment of unrestrained freedom, throbbed within her, a pulse so faint she sometimes wondered if she had imagined it altogether. She was living a life that was not her own, a narrative written for her by duty and circumstance. Elara remembered a younger version of herself, a girl who dreamed of studying art history in Florence, of getting lost in crowded city streets, of feeling the warmth of the sun in a place where no one knew her name. That girl had faded over the years, her vibrant colors muted by the gray reality of her obligations. Now her days were a repeating pattern of caring for her father, mending broken spines, and trying to hold back the tide of financial ruin that lapped at their doorstep. She was a character in a tragedy, moving through the motions dictated by the plot, with no power to change the inevitable, heartbreaking conclusion that loomed just over the horizon. As dusk bled across the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows of the ancient oaks across the lawn, Ilara stood at the library window. She watched the distant, glittering lights of the city begin to prick the darkness, a constellation of lives being lived with purpose and passion. A profound sense of finality settled over her, a quiet certainty that the fragile equilibrium of her world could not hold for much longer. The dust was settling not just on the furniture but on her soul, and she felt a deep, instinctual dread that a storm was coming. It wasn't a thought, but a feeling. A low vibration in the air that promised to shatter the suffocating silence of her life, for better or for worse. The world outside was about to come crashing in. The small town of Oakhaven existed in a different century from the city whose distant glow she could see at night. It was a place of quiet judgments and long memories, where family names were currencies of their own. When Ilara walked its cobblestone streets for supplies, she felt the weight of countless eyes. She was a living relic, the last Vance girl, a subject of whispered pity and veiled curiosity. The townspeople saw the frayed cuffs of her coat, the weary set of her shoulders, and remembered the opulence of her grandparents. To them she was a tragic figure in a local legend, a ghost haunting the present. She would offer a polite, distant smile, her gaze fixed on the ground, feeling less like a person and more like a historical artifact on public display, her every crack and flaw noted for later discussion. Her days were a metronome of quiet obligations, each beat marking the slow erosion of her own life. The morning began with her father. She would prepare his tray, weak tea, dry toast, a soft-boiled egg, and carry it to his chambers, the air growing colder as she moved deeper into the house's heart. He was a man whittled down by illness and regret, but his eyes, sharp and blue, still held the unyielding pride of a Vance. He would speak of the past, as if it were a tangible place they could one day revisit, never acknowledging the scent of decay that clung to the damask curtains or the silence of a house with no staff. His gratitude was a cage, his love a gilded chain, and every gentle word he spoke was another bar, locking her into a life of selfless, silent servitude. The grand ballroom, once the epicenter of Vance society, was now a cavern of ghosts. Dust sheets, like pale shrouds, covered the ornate furniture, and the crystal chandelier hung like a skeletal spider, its prisms coated in a fine gray film. Sometimes, Ilara would stand in the center of the vast, empty space, her hand resting on the cold marble of the mantelpiece, and try to hear the echoes of laughter and music. She could almost see the swirl of silk gowns and the flash of jewels, a vibrant world of which she was only a pale imitation. This room was the most potent symbol of her inheritance, a legacy of magnificent emptiness, a grand stage for a play that had long since ended. She was the sole audience member, left to applaud the ghosts of a life she had never known. The Daily Mail was a ritual of quiet terror. Tucked between local circulars and the occasional letter from a distant, well-meaning relative was a growing stack of official-looking envelopes. Final notices, letters from creditors, warnings from the bank, each one a paper cut to her soul. She became an expert at intercepting them, hiding them in an old hat box in her closet before her father could see. The crisp, impersonal font of the letters felt like an invasion, a language of a brutal, modern world that had no respect for history or honor. Holding them, she could feel the foundation of her world trembling, the weight of numbers and deadlines threatening to bring the ancient stone walls crashing down around them. Each seal she broke was an act of quiet, desperate bravery. There was a life she was supposed to have lived, a path laid out for her by tradition. His name was Arthur Penhaligon, the son of a neighboring family whose fortunes had weathered the changing times more gracefully. He was kind, respectable, and utterly predictable. Her mother, in her final years, had spoken of the match with a hopeful sigh. A union with Arthur would have been safe, a comfortable continuation of the old ways. But now the Vances had nothing to offer but a crumbling roof and a mountain of debt. The possibility of that life, as dull as it might have seemed, was now a painful reminder of her own unmarketable status. She was no longer a suitable bride for a man like Arthur. She was a liability, a keeper of ruins, a woman whose only dowry was her family's beautiful, tragic decline. The library was both her sanctuary and her cell. Within its walls, surrounded by the silent, waiting stories of centuries, she felt a sense of purpose. The meticulous work of restoration was a meditation, a way to impose order on a world spiraling into chaos. Her delicate fingers could mend torn pages, re-stitch broken bindings, and halt the slow march of decay. Here, she was not just Elara Vance, the daughter of a failing house, but a skilled artisan, a guardian of history. Yet, the very silence that soothed her also amplified her profound loneliness. She would trace the passionate words of poets and the daring adventures of heroines, their lives a vibrant tapestry of love and loss, and feel the stark, unwritten emptiness of her own pages. The books were her friends, but they were also a constant, painful reminder of all she would never be. One afternoon, a delivery boy, careless and young, left behind a glossy society magazine on the hall table. Elara picked it up, her fingers tracing the image of a smiling woman on a yacht, the sun turning the sea behind her into a field of diamonds. She flipped through the pages, a voyeur looking into a different universe. There were pictures of art galleries in New York, bustling cafes in Paris, and sprawling minimalist homes made of glass and steel that seemed to defy gravity. It was a world of effortless movement, of bright, clean light, and of people whose faces showed no trace of the heavy, ancestral burdens she carried. She closed the magazine, the scent of expensive perfume rising from its pages, and the smell of dust and damp in her own home seemed suddenly, suffocatingly, unbearable. Her father lived in a carefully constructed reality, and it was her primary duty to maintain its walls. He would sit by the fire, his thin hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and speak of replanting the East Gardens in the spring or of reopening the stables. He would recount tales of his grandfather's triumphs in business, blind to the irony that the very same ventures had led to their ruin. Elara would nod and agree, a painful knot tightening in her chest. To challenge his delusions would be to break his spirit, the last thing he had left. And so she became a co-conspirator in his fiction, propping up a fantasy of solvency and honor while she secretly fought off the wolves at the door. Her silence was a lie, a final, exhausting act of love. The house was beginning to betray her. It was no longer just the slow, dignified decay she had grown accustomed to, but a more urgent and aggressive collapse. A persistent leak in the west wing began to stain the silk wallpaper, the sound of dripping water a constant, maddening metronome counting down their final days. During a winter storm, a pane of glass in the conservatory shattered, letting the wind howl through the dying plants. These were not problems she could fix with glue and thread. They were symptoms of a terminal illness, signs that the very bones of the manor were giving up. She felt a primal fear, the terror of an animal whose burrow is about to be washed away. The house was dying, and it was taking her with it. Then, the final letter arrived. It was different from the others. The envelope was thick, creamy, and bore the stark, aggressive logo of a company she had never heard of, Thorn Holdings. There was no desperate plea for payment, no final warning. It was a simple, chillingly polite notification. The entirety of the Vance family's consolidated debt had been acquired. The letter was not a threat. It was a statement of ownership. The name Julian Thorne was printed at the bottom, a signature as sharp and angular as broken glass. Elara held the single sheet of paper, its weight feeling immense, world-altering. She knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in her veins, that this was not a creditor. This was a conqueror. The storm had a name, and it was coming for them. He did not arrive like a guest. He arrived like an invading force. A car, black and silent as a panther, glided up the gravel drive, its modern, predatory lines a stark violation of the manor's gentle decay. Elara watched from the library window as it came to a halt, the engine cutting out with a soft, expensive sigh that seemed to mock the house's weary groans. It sat there for a long moment, its tinted windows reflecting the gray, overgrown facade of her home, a dark mirror showing a distorted, menacing version of her reality. No one ever visited anymore, certainly not in a vehicle that looked as if it had been carved from a block of polished night. She felt a cold, dread coil in her stomach. This was not a visitor, but a reckoning. The letter from Thorn Holdings felt heavy in her pocket, a harbinger of this very moment. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged. He was tall, dressed in a suit so dark and perfectly tailored it seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light. He didn't look at the door. Instead, his gaze swept across the property, a slow, clinical assessment of the sagging roofline, the shuttered windows, the untamed ivy strangling the stone. It was not the look of an admirer of historical architecture, but of a surveyor calculating the cost of demolition. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, his expression a mask of detached control. There was a stillness about him, a coiled energy that spoke of immense power held in absolute check. In that instant, Alara understood that this man was not just a representative of Thorn Holdings. He was Thorn Holdings. He was the conqueror himself, come to inspect his new territory. Duty warred with a primal instinct to flee. Her father was napping upstairs, blissfully unaware of the predator standing on his crumbling doorstep. She had to face him, to be the gatekeeper of their ruin. Her hand trembled as she pulled back the heavy iron bolt on the front door. It groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the silent hall like a cry of pain. As she pulled the massive oak panel inward, they stood face to face. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, met hers. They were startlingly direct, devoid of any social pleasantry, and held a profound, chilling emptiness that seemed to bore straight through her defenses. She saw in them a vast, lonely landscape, a place where no warmth could survive. In that first, silent appraisal she felt utterly transparent, as if he could see every fear, every secret she had ever kept. "Ilara Vance," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, smooth and cold as polished marble, and it seemed to absorb all the sound in the cavernous entryway. "I am Julian Thorn." The name, spoken aloud, held a physical weight. He didn't wait for an invitation but stepped over the threshold, his expensive leather shoes silent on the worn stone flags. His presence was immediately overwhelming, a force of raw, modern energy that the ancient house seemed to shrink from. He moved with an economy of motion that was both graceful and menacing, his gaze sweeping over the faded tapestries and dusty portraits with an almost imperceptible curl of his lip, a silent judgment on the slow, dignified decay of her entire world. He was a creature of steel and glass, and he had just stepped into a museum of ghosts. She led him to the library, her sanctuary. The moment he entered, the room felt different, smaller, its quiet peace shattered by his dynamic presence. The air, usually thick with the comforting scent of old paper and beeswax, was now charged with the clean, sharp fragrance of his cologne and something else, the cold, metallic scent of power. He moved to the center of the room, a dark monolith among the warm, worn wood and faded leather. He ran a hand over a stack of books she had been mending, his touch not gentle or curious but proprietary, as if testing the quality of an asset. She watched his long, elegant fingers, noting the stark contrast between their manicured perfection and her own, faintly stained with ink and glue. He was everything this house was not, new, hard, and ruthlessly alive. "You have a considerable problem, Miss Vance," he began, his voice cutting through the silence. He didn't bother with pleasantries, his words as direct and unsparing as his gaze. He began to list the figures, the exact sum of the consolidated debt, the interest accrued, the final deadlines that had been ignored. He spoke of her family's financial history with an unnerving intimacy, referencing her grandfather's failed ventures and her father's desperate, misguided investments. It was a clinical, brutal autopsy of their downfall, delivered without a hint of sympathy. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. He wasn't just a creditor, he was the historian of their failure, and he had come to read the final damning chapter aloud to her. A spark of ancestral pride, something she thought had long been extinguished, flared within her. "My family's name has stood for honor and integrity for 200 years, she said, her voice barely a whisper but steady, each word a small stone thrown against a tidal wave. "These are just numbers on a page. They don't tell the whole story." For the first time his impassive expression shifted. He turned his full attention to her, his head tilting slightly, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even a sliver of interest, in his cold eyes. He had expected tears, pleading, the predictable response of the vanquished. He had not expected this quiet, fragile defiance. He saw the tremor in her hands, but he also saw the unyielding strength in her gaze, and it intrigued him. He was a man who appreciated rare, unbreakable things. He began to pace slowly, his movements deliberate and predatory, circling her as if she were the last, most fascinating artifact in the room. He stopped in front of a large oil portrait of her great-grandfather, the formidable patriarch who had built the Vance fortune. Julian stared at the stern, painted face for a long moment, his own expression becoming unreadable, a mask of complex emotions. "Honor," he murmured, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "Honor is the luxury of those who have never had to fight for survival." "It's a beautiful story you tell yourselves while the foundations rot." The bitterness in his voice was raw and real, a brief crack in his icy facade that revealed a glimpse of a deep, personal wound. His war against her family was not just business, it was a crusade. The space between them crackled with an unspoken energy. He moved away from the portrait and closed the distance between them until he was standing directly in front of her. He was so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. She could feel the warmth from his body, a stark contrast to the perpetual chill of the room, and was acutely aware of his height, his sheer physical dominance. She was trapped in his orbit, held captive by a force that was equal parts terror and a strange, unfamiliar pull. His eyes dropped from hers, tracing the curve of her cheek, the line of her throat, where a pulse hammered wildly. It was not a look of desire, but of intense, unsettling scrutiny, as if he were memorizing her flaws, cataloging her vulnerabilities for later use. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost intimate tone that sent a shiver down her spine. "Every problem has a solution, Miss Vance," he said softly, the words a silken threat. "And everything, and everyone, has a price." He held her gaze for one more heart-stopping second, letting the implication of his words sink into the very marrow of her bones. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the library, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, profound silence. Ilara remained frozen, her body trembling, her mind reeling. He had not made his proposition yet, but he had laid the groundwork. He had shown her the cage, and now he was simply waiting for her to realize she was already inside it. The storm had not just arrived. It had a voice, a face, and it had just spoken her name. The silence Julian Thorne left behind was a living entity, far more menacing than the house's usual quietude. It pulsed with the echo of his final words, a venom that seeped into the very fabric of the room. Ilara stood frozen, her hand clutching the back of a leather chair for support, her knuckles white. The library, once her sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene, the air tainted by the cold, transactional nature of his presence. He had not just assessed her home, he had appraised her soul and named a price that was both impossibly high and devastatingly simple. A single night. The words were a brand, searing themselves into her mind. The transaction he proposed was so monstrous, so far beyond the realm of her sheltered imagination, that it felt unreal, a dark fairy tale whispered in the gloom. His next move was not an appearance, but an invasion of a different kind. 2 days later, the ancient telephone in the hall shrilled, its sound so alien and violent it made her jump. She lifted the heavy bakelite receiver, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Vance residence," she whispered, her voice thin. "Miss Vance?" His voice returned, a low, controlled sound that was somehow more intimate and unsettling over the wire. It was devoid of warmth, yet it carried an unnerving familiarity, as if he had spoken to her 1,000 times before. He didn't mention his proposition directly. Instead, he asked if she had, quote, considered the reality of her situation. He was a master of implication, his words wrapping around her like silken chains, tightening with every calculated pause, reminding her that he held the key to her cage. Ilara found herself living in a state of suspended terror, caught between two impossible futures. One was the slow, dignified death of everything she knew, the loss of her home, the final humiliation of her father, the erasure of the Vance name into a footnote of local history. The other was a swift, violent sacrifice of a part of herself she had never even known, a sacred, untouched core she had preserved out of shyness and circumstance. She would watch her father, his face etched with a peaceful ignorance she fought desperately to maintain, and feel the weight of her choice crushing her. Was honor a principle to die for? Or was it a luxury she could no longer afford? The question haunted her waking hours and turned her dreams into fevered landscapes of locked doors and predatory shadows. He summoned her a week later. A sleek black car, as silent and ominous as the one that first appeared, was sent to collect her. The journey into the city was a disorienting blur of speed and modernity. It deposited her before a skyscraper of glass and steel that pierced the clouds, a monument to a world that operated on logic and power, not tradition and sentiment. His office was on the top floor, a minimalist expanse with a view that stretched to the horizon, making the world below seem insignificant. He sat behind a vast desk of polished obsidian, a king in his sterile, skybound fortress. He was no longer an invader in her world. She was now a supplicant in his, a fragile, historical artifact brought before the architect of the future for judgment. He gestured for her to sit, the chair a cold sculpture of leather and chrome. He didn't speak of the night. Instead, he laid out papers on his desk, deeds, ledgers, foreclosure notices, a mountain of evidence detailing her family's ruin. He spoke in a low, dispassionate monotone, explaining the legal mechanics of her destruction. It was a performance of absolute control, designed to strip away any remaining hope, to show her that this was not a negotiation between people but the inevitable conclusion of a mathematical equation. Yet, as he spoke, his gaze kept drifting from the papers to her face, a flicker of something unreadable in his stormy eyes. He was trying to reduce her to a variable in his calculation. But some part of him was failing, distracted by the very humanity he sought to conquer. As he outlined the final stages of the foreclosure process, a bitter, almost imperceptible edge entered his voice. "It must be a comfort," he murmured, his gaze fixed on a point beyond her, somewhere out in the sprawling city below, "to have a name that opens doors. To inherit a world you never had to build." The comment was a stone thrown into the placid surface of his control, revealing a glimpse of the turbulent depths beneath. For the first time she heard not just a conqueror, but a man defined by a deep and ancient wound. The source of his ruthless ambition was not mere greed. It was a profound, burning resentment for the world she represented, a world that had, in some way she couldn't yet understand, excluded or destroyed him. The monster suddenly had a history. Her fear for a fleeting moment was eclipsed by a strange, unexpected surge of empathy. "You see the name, the house," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the vast, silent office. "But you don't see the weight. It's not a privilege to be the final curator of a legacy of failure. It's a cage made of honor." Her words hung in the air, a truth so simple and raw that it seemed to momentarily stun him. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the mask of the ruthless billionaire slipped. He saw not a symbol of old money, but a fellow prisoner, trapped by a different kind of past. The chasm between them, for one fragile second, was bridged by a shared understanding of being bound by history, his by its absence and hers by its suffocating presence. As the meeting concluded, he handed her a pen to sign a preliminary document acknowledging their discussion. As she reached for it, his fingers brushed against hers. It was the briefest of contacts, skin against skin, but it sent a bolt of pure electricity through her. His skin was warm, a shocking, living heat that contradicted the coldness of his demeanor and the sterile environment he inhabited. The touch was an earthquake, shattering the abstract horror of their arrangement into a terrifyingly physical reality. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her breath catching in her throat. He was no longer a concept, a faceless predator. He was a man, real and warm, and that single, accidental touch had awakened a part of her she never knew existed. Julian, too, recoiled, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. For a man who orchestrated billion-dollar deals with glacial calm, the unplanned contact had rattled him to his core. He stared at his own hand for a fraction of a second, a look of profound confusion and self-loathing flashing across his features before the mask of indifference slammed back into place. He had orchestrated this entire scenario to be a demonstration of his power, a cold transaction where he was in complete control. But that simple, unintentional touch had introduced an unpredictable variable. It was a spark of heat in his calculated, frozen world, and his instinct was to crush it, to deny the bewildering feeling it had ignited within him, a feeling that was dangerously close to a longing he had long since buried. The drive back to the manor was a silent torment. Alara stared unseeingly at the world rushing past her window, her entire being consumed by the memory of that single point of contact. The warmth of his skin lingered on hers, a phantom sensation that both terrified and intrigued her. She had spent her life among the cool, dry textures of old paper and brittle leather. The living heat of a man's touch was a foreign language. Her body was suddenly, instinctively, beginning to understand. The proposition, once a monstrous abstraction, now had a physical anchor. It was tied to the memory of that warmth, to the stormy look in his eyes, and a terrifying, treacherous whisper of desire began to weave itself into the fabric of her fear. She was beginning to want the very thing that would destroy her. Julian's campaign of psychological warfare escalated. He began to send his people to the manor. An art historian arrived to catalog the paintings, his white-gloved hands treating her family's portraits like assets in a portfolio. A structural engineer roamed the grounds, taking measurements and making notes, his presence a constant reminder that the house was no longer hers to protect. These were not acts of courtesy. They were strategic incursions, a way for him to insinuate himself into every corner of her life, to dismantle her world piece by piece before her very eyes. It was a cruel, methodical process of possession, demonstrating that he could take everything from her, not just her home, but her history, her memories, her very identity. Each visitor was another turn of the screw, tightening the pressure on her resolve. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She found the number for his private line on one of the documents and called him, her hand trembling with a rage that momentarily burned away her fear. "Stop it," she said the moment he answered, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Stop sending your vultures to pick over the bones of my life before it's even over. Is this part of the price? To watch you dismantle my world one painting, one stone at a time." Her anger was a shield, the only weapon she possessed. She accused him of a cruelty that went beyond their business arrangement, of taking a sadistic pleasure in her humiliation, in stripping away her dignity before she had even formally surrendered it to him. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a heavy, static-filled void. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The cold, corporate shell was gone, replaced by something rougher, more raw. "I need to understand what I am buying," he said, the words low and freighted with a meaning that went far beyond the house. "Or what I am destroying." The ambiguity was devastating. Was he talking about the property, the legacy, or her? The line between the three had blurred completely. In that moment of unguarded honesty, she understood that this was not just a transaction for him either. It was an obsession, a compulsion to possess or annihilate something he couldn't comprehend, something her quiet defiance represented. He was as trapped in this dynamic as she was. The breaking point came not from him, but from within the manor's walls. One evening her father collapsed, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The local doctor came, his face grave, and spoke of specialists in the city, of expensive tests and treatments that were so far beyond their means they might as well have been on the moon. As Alara sat by her father's bedside, holding his frail, cool hand, the full weight of their reality crashed down upon her. Her honor, her innocence, her moral code, they were all abstract principles. But the sound of her father's labored breathing was real. The fear in his eyes was real. The cold, hard numbers on the doctor's estimate were real. Her sacrifice was no longer a choice. It had become an inevitability. With hands that felt like lead, she picked up the phone and dialed his number. The call was answered on the first ring as if he had been waiting. She didn't waste time on pleasantries or negotiations. The fight had gone out of her, leaving behind only a hollow, echoing resignation. "Yes," she said, the single word a death sentence and a prayer. "I accept your terms." It felt as if she were speaking from a great distance, her voice belonging to someone else. A tragic heroine in one of her books finally succumbing to her fate. The word, once spoken, could not be unsaid. It was a key turning in a lock, sealing her destiny and closing the door forever on the woman she had once been. Julian's response was not the gloating triumph she had expected. There was another long, unnerving silence, and when he spoke, his voice was subdued, almost somber. "My penthouse, Friday night, 8 o'clock. He gave her the address. The words clipped and precise, as if he were dictating the terms of a merger, not arranging an intimate encounter. He had won. He had acquired the rarest asset of all, the one thing he both despised and craved. But his tone held no victory, only the heavy, weary finality of a man who had just set in motion a series of events whose consequences he was only now, too late, beginning to fear. He had gotten what he wanted, and in doing so, had set the stage for losing something far more valuable. On that final afternoon, Alara walked through the silent rooms of the manor, a ghost saying goodbye to her own life. She ran her fingers over the dusty spine of a book, traced the faded pattern on a tapestry, and looked at her own reflection in a tarnished silver mirror. The face that stared back was that of a stranger, a woman standing on the precipice of an unimaginable abyss. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was now mingled with something else, a terrifying electric current of anticipation. She was stepping out of the pages of her predictable, sheltered story and into the heart of a dark, unknown narrative. She was sacrificing her innocence to save her past, but a small, treacherous part of her wondered what she might find in the wreckage. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, a glass box climbing the spine of the city. With each floor, Ilara felt herself moving further away from the earth, from the familiar scent of damp soil and decaying paper, and into an alien atmosphere of cold air and invisible, expensive fragrances. The doors slid open not into a hallway, but directly into his world. It was a vast, cavernous space of polished black floors and immense windows that framed the sprawling city lights like a captive galaxy. She felt infinitesimally small, a fragile ghost from another century set adrift in his stark, hyper-modern reality. Across the room, Julian Thorne stood silhouetted against the glittering abyss, a figure carved from shadow and power, his stillness a predatory weight in the crushing silence. He was waiting for her, the final piece in his collection. He did not move to greet her. He simply watched her take the hesitant steps across the polished floor, her sensible, worn shoes making no sound, as if she were already an apparition. He gestured toward a low-slung leather sofa, the movement economical and devoid of warmth. "A drink?" he asked, his voice a flat, controlled baritone that the vast room seemed to swallow. She shook her head, clutching her worn coat around herself as if it were a shield. He was trying to maintain the cold artifice of their arrangement, to perform the role of the master of the transaction, but she saw the rigid line of his jaw, the way his fingers, when he poured a drink for himself, were clenched just a little too tightly. He was not the calm, detached conqueror he pretended to be. He was a man bracing for an impact, and that small fissure in his armor was more terrifying than any overt threat. Her gaze drifted, seeking an anchor in the impersonal space, and found it. On a stark, minimalist side table, amidst the sleek lines of chrome and glass, sat a single dissonant object. A small, silver-framed photograph, its edges worn smooth with time. It was not a professional portrait, but a faded, candid snapshot of a woman with tired, kind eyes, smiling faintly at something beyond the frame. It was the only object in the entire penthouse that looked truly loved, the only thing that held a history. Her fear was momentarily eclipsed by a powerful, instinctual curiosity. She took a half-step towards it, her movement an unconscious question. She felt his gaze sharpen on her, his posture stiffening, as if her attention on that small, sacred relic was a greater violation than the one she was here to commit. He saw where she was looking, and for a second, a raw, defensive anger flashed in his eyes, a primal instinct to shield his only vulnerability. But her expression was not one of pity or morbid curiosity. It was one of simple, quiet recognition of a hidden pain. The anger faltered, replaced by a weariness that seemed to age him a decade. "My mother," he said, the words rough, as if torn from his throat, and then, as if a dam had finally broken, the story began to spill out. He spoke of a life not in a crumbling manor, but in a cramped apartment that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. He spoke of watching his father, a good man broken by debt, being humiliated by creditors who saw him not as a person, but as a number on a ledger, men whose names and legacies afforded them a casual, devastating cruelty. The narrative of the ruthless billionaire unraveled, revealing the broken boy hiding beneath the layers of tailored wool and cold ambition. His entire life, he confessed, had been a reaction to that single, defining moment of his family's ruin. He hadn't just built an empire, he had forged a weapon, a battering ram of wealth and power designed to smash the gates of the world that had cast his family out. Destroying old money dynasties like the Vances was never just about business. It was a crusade, a desperate, obsessive ritual to exorcise the ghost of his own father's shame. As the final bitter words left his lips, the mask of control shattered completely, and a single, shocking tear cut a silent path down his sculpted cheek, a glistening testament to a wound that had never healed. In that moment, the contract became meaningless. The house, the debt, her own carefully guarded innocence, it all dissolved into insignificance. All she could see was the profound, abyssal loneliness of the man standing before her, a king trapped in a fortress of his own making, haunted by the very ghosts he sought to vanquish. Her fear vanished, washed away by a tidal wave of empathy so powerful it felt like a form of grace. This, she realized, was her true act of transgression, not the selling of her body, but the giving of her compassion to the man who had set out to destroy her. She closed the distance between them, her movement as deliberate as the mending of a priceless manuscript, and slowly raised her hand to his face. Her fingers, stained with the ink of forgotten stories, were impossibly gentle as she brushed the tear from his skin. He flinched at her touch, a tremor running through his powerful frame, but then he leaned into her hand, his eyes closing in a silent, absolute surrender. He was no longer the predator, but the one who was wounded, and she, inexplicably, was the one with the power to soothe. When he opened his eyes, the cold, stormy sea was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored the deepest, most secret yearnings of her own soul. He did not take or demand. His gaze was a question, a plea for something he didn't know how to name. She answered with a slow, deliberate nod. The kiss that followed was not one of passion or conquest, but of a desperate, shattering recognition. It tasted of solitude and salt, the collision of two broken worlds in a single, impossible moment of clemency. He lifted her into his arms as if she were made of spun glass, his movements imbued with a reverence that undid her completely. He carried her from the cold, intimidating expanse of the living room into the hushed darkness of his private chambers. The city lights became a muted, distant glow through the vast windows, a silent audience to their unwritten story. There were no more words. Their contract had been rewritten in a language of touch, of slow, searching movements that spoke of years of unspoken loneliness. The cool, crisp silk of the sheets against her back was a shocking contrast to the burning heat of his skin against hers. This was no longer a transaction. It was a communion, a desperate, shared search for warmth in the heart of a cold, indifferent world, and she was no longer a victim but a willing participant. In the final, quiet moments of her innocence, there was no pain or shame, only a profound, breathtaking sense of connection that obliterated every fear she had ever known. It was a silent, shattering revelation, a discovery of a part of herself she never knew existed. For him, the act was not one of possession but of being seen, of allowing another soul to breach the walls of his gilded prison for the very first time. He whispered her name against her throat, the sound not of a conqueror claiming his prize, but of a starving man finally being fed. In the depths of their shared vulnerability, in the space between their histories of pain and duty, they forged a fragile, temporary sanctuary. The price had been paid, but the exchange had yielded a currency neither of them had ever imagined. They lay tangled in the aftermath, the profound silence of the penthouse no longer empty, but filled with the soft, intimate sounds of their mingled breaths. The city below pulsed with a life that felt a world away. Lara traced the faint, silvery line of a scar above his heart, a physical map of the territory he had just surrendered to her. He held her with a desperate tenderness, as if he feared she might vanish with the coming dawn, a dream he could not bear to lose. The terms of their cruel bargain had been met, but in its place, A new, unspoken contract had been forged in the darkness. The night was supposed to be an ending, for her honor, for his revenge. Instead, it had become a terrifying, beautiful, and utterly unforeseen beginning. Everything had changed, and neither of them had any idea how to face the light. The journey down was a descent into a world that no longer recognized her. Ilara left his penthouse as the first blush of dawn stained the sky a bruised purple, moving like a phantom through the silent, opulent spaces. She did not look back. On the polished mahogany of his nightstand, she had left the legal document, the contract for her soul, now voided and meaningless. It was not a trophy for him, or a statement of defiance from her, but simply a relic of a transaction that had been consumed by something far more complex and devastating. The cold, pre-dawn air that hit her on the street felt like a slap, a brutal re-entry into a reality where what had transpired in the skybound fortress was an impossible, dangerous secret. She was a ghost returning to her grave, irrevocably haunted by the warmth of a life she could never have. Upon returning to the manor, the familiar scent of damp stone and decaying paper wrapped around her like a shroud. The house was exactly as she had left it, a silent tomb of honorable decay, yet everything felt alien. Her footsteps echoed with a new, hollow resonance on the worn floorboards. She had saved this place. She had paid the ultimate price to preserve these walls, to protect the fragile illusion her father lived in. But as she stood in the grand, silent hall, the portraits of her ancestors staring down with their painted, judgmental eyes, she felt no triumph. She felt only the profound, isolating weight of her transgression. She had brought the modern, brutal world into their sanctuary, not as an invader, but within her own body. The house was safe, but she had become its most guarded, terrible secret. Julian woke to the deafening roar of silence. The vast bed, usually a kingdom of solitude, he commanded, felt like a barren, empty continent. The faint, ghostly scent of her, a delicate mix of old books, and something uniquely, sweetly Ilara, lingered on the pillow beside him, a tormenting piece of evidence that she had been real. His eyes fell upon the voided contract on the nightstand. It was a testament to his victory, the final nail in the coffin of Avant's legacy. Yet it felt like an epitaph for his own soul. He had won. He had taken the one thing he believed would complete his revenge, and in doing so had opened a void within himself that was 1,000 times more cavernous than the one he had tried to fill. The perfect, sterile world he had built for himself had been breached, and its silence was now the sound of her absence. A deep, chilling shame settled into Ilara's bones. In the tarnished mirror of her bedroom she saw a stranger. Her eyes, once pools of quiet resignation, now held a new, haunted depth. Her skin, where he had touched her, seemed to carry a phantom heat, a memory that was both a brand of guilt and a whisper of a terrifying, unknown pleasure. She had committed the act to save her father, to uphold her duty, but the memory of Julian's brokenness, of his shocking vulnerability, complicated everything. She had not been taken by a monster. She had communed with a wounded man. This realization was the heaviest burden of all. The sacrifice had not been clean or simple. It was a messy, emotional cataclysm that had shattered her moral compass, leaving her adrift in a sea of confusing, contradictory feelings of sin and salvation. He tried to immerse himself in the cold, hard logic of his empire. He stalked the floors of his trading rooms. The staccato rhythm of the markets, a familiar, comforting chaos. He dismantled a rival corporation with his signature, surgical precision, his mind sharp, and his decisions brutal. Yet it was all a hollow performance. Through the vast windows of his office, the city sprawled below, a concrete jungle he had conquered, but his gaze was unfocused, searching. He found himself replaying every moment of the night, the tremor in her hands, the quiet strength in her voice, the astonishing grace of her touch. He who saw emotion as a weakness to be exploited was now paralyzed by it. The ghost of her compassion haunted him, a force more powerful than any market trend or hostile takeover, and he had no strategy to defend against it. The official letter arrived a week later, its crisp, expensive stationery a stark contrast to the usual collection of final notices. It was from a prestigious law firm, its language cold, formal, and devastatingly final. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that the entirety of the Vance family debt had been acquired by an anonymous benefactor and forgiven in full. All liens on the property were released. The manor was theirs, free and clear. Ilara watched as her father read the letter, a slow, dawning joy illuminating his frail features, tears of relief streaming down his face. He called it a miracle, a testament to the enduring honor of their name. Ilara simply nodded, the lie a bitter acid in her throat. She had bought his miracle, and the receipt was the silent, screaming void in her own soul. But in the quiet solitude of the following days, something other than guilt began to stir within Ilara. A fragile yet resilient shoot of strength pushed its way through the compacted soil of her fear and shame. She had faced the worst the world could offer, had walked into the dragon's lair, and had not been consumed. She had survived. The act that was meant to break her had, in some paradoxical way, liberated her. She was no longer just the timid guardian of a dying legacy. She was a woman who had made an impossible choice, a woman who had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. She began to move through the manor, not as a curator of the past, but as the architect of a future, her newfound strength, a quiet, secret revolution against the life that had once imprisoned her. Julian's obsession took a new, more desperate form. He who never looked back found himself consumed by the past, specifically hers. He had his security team compile a discreet, exhaustive file not on the Vance finances, but on Ilara herself. He read about her quiet academic achievements, her passion for Renaissance art, the small, unnoticed acts of kindness reported by townspeople. He studied photographs of her as a young girl, her face open and full of a light he felt he had personally extinguished. This intelligence gathering was not a strategy. It was a form of self-flagellation, a desperate attempt to understand the woman whose quiet integrity had laid waste to his carefully constructed defenses. He was trying to piece together the soul he had sought to purchase, only to realize it was priceless and now, hauntingly, beyond his reach. The world outside the manor walls became a source of quiet torment. When Ilara went to the village for supplies, she could feel the change. The whispers that had once been tinged with pity now felt sharp with a judgment she could only imagine. Had they heard rumors? Did they somehow know? She felt marked, as if her secret were a visible stain upon her skin. She found herself retreating deeper into the sanctuary of her home. The ancient stones, a fortress against a world she no longer knew how to navigate. The manor was no longer a cage of duty, but a refuge for the woman she was becoming, a complex, wounded creature who understood that the greatest monsters often hid behind masks of power, and that the purest acts of love sometimes required the most terrible of sins. They existed in their separate worlds, bound by the memory of a single night. He was the king of a vast, empty empire, surrounded by everything money could buy, and utterly starved of the one thing he now craved. She was the mistress of a saved but haunted house, her future secured at the cost of her past. The silence between them was a tangible entity, a vast, charged space filled with unspoken words, unresolved emotions, and the agonizing question of what came next. The transaction was complete, the debt paid in full, but the night had created a new kind of ledger, an emotional balance sheet that left them both profoundly, inextricably indebted to one another, with no currency in the world left to settle the account. Months bled into the quiet rhythm of the seasons, each one a slow, healing balm on Ilara's fractured soul. She had begun reclaiming her life, not just the manor. She started replanting the East Gardens, her hands, once dedicated to the delicate art of preservation, now finding a new purpose in coaxing life from the dormant soil. One crisp autumn afternoon, as a low, golden light filtered through the thinning leaves of the ancient oaks, she saw him. He was standing at the edge of the property, just beyond the crumbling stone wall, looking not at her, but at the house. He wore no suit, no armor of wealth, just a simple dark coat that seemed inadequate against the encroaching chill. He was not a conqueror surveying his territory, but a pilgrim who had lost his way, drawn back to the site of his most profound and devastating revelation. She felt no fear, only a deep, weary sense of inevitability. Wiping the rich soil from her hands onto her trousers, she walked towards him, her steps steady on the damp earth. The distance between them was a chasm, filled with the ghosts of their single night, a space charged with unspoken words and unresolved pain. He turned as she approached, and his eyes, stripped of their cold, stormy defense, were filled with a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored her own. He looked like a man who had not slept in months, haunted by a silence he could no longer endure. There were no apologies on his lips, for they both knew that words were a currency too cheap for the debt that lay between them. He had come not to speak, but to be seen, to stand before her without his power, without his walls, and await her judgment. In his hands he held a small, leather-bound book. It was not an ancient artifact, but a new volume, its gilt lettering gleaming in the fading light. He held it out to her, a silent, desperate offering. "I heard you once wanted to study art history," he said, his voice rough, unused. "In Florence." The book was a collection of essays on the restoration of Renaissance frescoes. It was a gesture of such astonishing, intimate understanding that it took her breath away. He had not just listened to her. He had remembered the ghost of the girl she used to be, the one who dreamed of a life beyond the manor's walls. He was not offering her a gift. He was returning a piece of her soul that he had never had the right to touch, a quiet admission that he had seen her, truly seen her, beyond the transaction and the ruin. Ilara looked from the book to his face, and in that moment, she understood the true nature of her choice. She could refuse him, could turn and walk back to the safety of her restored world, leaving him forever in the cold. That would be justice. But justice felt like another kind of prison. The man before her was as much a ruin as her ancestral home had been, his foundations rotted by a pain he had carried his entire life. To heal herself, she realized, she could not leave another soul to fester in a wound she now understood so intimately. Her compassion, the very thing that had led her to his bed, was not a weakness to be overcome, but her most profound and unassailable strength. It was the one thing he had failed to conquer, the one thing he had come back begging for. Slowly she reached out and took the book. Her fingers brushed against his, and the spark was still there, not as a jolt of terror or forbidden desire, but as a low, steady current of recognition. It was the touch of two survivors acknowledging a shared, indelible scar. She did not smile, nor did she offer words of forgiveness. Instead, she gave him something far more precious, an invitation. She turned and gestured back toward the garden she had been tending, toward the newly turned earth and the promise of spring bulbs sleeping beneath the surface. It was a silent acknowledgement that their story was not about endings, but about the slow, arduous, and deeply uncertain work of restoration. She was offering him a chance not to erase the damage, but to help cultivate something new from the wreckage they had made together. They stood for a moment in the twilight, two solitary figures on the edge of a world they might one day rebuild. The path forward was not clear, and the ghosts of their past would forever walk beside them, a constant reminder of the price that had been paid. But for the first time, the future did not feel like a closed book or a final chapter. It felt like a blank page, terrifying and beautiful in its limitless possibility. If their story of finding light in the darkest of bargains and mending the most broken of pieces has touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe, like, and share. Let us know in the comments what it means to you to see two souls begin the long journey back to themselves.